The doctor joins us. This is the second panel on the Forum on Pensions 2020, which will take place today and tomorrow. The subject for the second panel is criteria for the sustainability of pension systems from a technical point of view, but also considering the most relevant part, which is the social part. So, pension systems, as we consider, should guarantee an appropriate coverage, solvency for those profits, and financial sustainability. Without these variables, we cannot really talk about harmony that will lead to the well being of Social Security and pension systems in general. The ideal coverage for all pension systems should be 100% of the population. That should be the target for governments and societies, while the amount of profit should allow people not to be at risk of poverty in the last stage of their life without compromising the public finance of states and nations. That is why designing and implementing a pension system should be done responding to social dialogue, but also with a quantitative and qualitative analysis of the demographic, economic, and financial conditions of the country. In this way, the system or systems will be a bridge between the problems of the society and the full well being which society is entitled to.
The second panel shall analyze the criteria behind the reform and installment of pension system, something not historical, but something that could actually be taken to practice. I have a couple of questions here that were sent to our panel members. These are guideline questions, so they may base their presentation, their conference on these questions. These questions are what technical elements should be taken into consideration in the design of a correct pension system. How can you have this convergence of different elements, social element included in a pension system? And finally, how can technical and social aspects be translated in sustainable legal framework in the long run that guarantees the right to a pension? So we will try to answer these questions, like I mentioned a while ago. So we'll start with Dr. Elsevier. But we'll start with Dr. Angel Guillermo Ruiz Moreno. He's the president of the American Association of Jurists for Social Security. He's an attorney from the University of Guadalajara. Dr. Angel Guillermo has worked as professor and researcher in several Mexican and Latin American universities. He's a published author. Social security is his area of specialty. Joining us too, we have Carlos Contreras Cruz. He's a actuarial investigator of Inter-American Conference Social Security, an actuary from Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico. He has a master's in management of social security systems from the Alcalá de Henares University in Spain. He's been part of faculty in social sciences school, and he's been a professor of human capital, both national and internationally. He's member of Academia de Seguridad Social and a published author on the subject. The last book was published this year, 2020. It's an honor having him here. Dr. Elsevier, I will also introduce. She will come at some point. Dr. Elsevier Cruda Casillero, a bachelor's degree in actuarial sciences from Sao Paulo, Brazil University. She has a PhD in economical and entrepreneurial sciences. Expertise for over 3 years. She was a member of economic planning from Caja. She has also worked in several public offices in her country, Panama. So I will now pass the floor to Dr. Angel Guillermo. So please start trying to reply the answers I talked about right at the beginning. So the floor is yours. Well, thank you very much for your kind introduction. And I would like to thank the General Secretariat of the Inter-American Conference Social Security for having me here in this panel. I would like to start quoting quoting myself. If Social Security didn't exist, we need to invent it. And if the one that we have is not serving us the way it should, then we would need to reinvent it. So let me start by saying that as an attorney, the law always has an important socio-political dimension, and its end is achieving justice. Thus, to achieve an adequate financial sustainability in Social Security, it is important to have the intervention of the state in a social, public, and social security system that provides the whole society with the necessary legal certainty to have their protection, allowing us to have a dignifying life, because that is the humanitarian objective. Something feasible to achieve for two very powerful reasons. Number one, that our social security systems are of public utility. That means they're the sole responsibility of the government. That's why its cost is not an expenditure, but rather an investment in the best thing a country has, its people. And reason number two is that in matters of social security, if the state cannot protect every single inhabitant of a country, then nobody can. Being this the first obligation of our government officials, taking care of the people. Because, I mean, if you ask who rules, those who rules us, the answer from the legal standpoint is very clear, and that's the law. The law of all laws, which in this case is our national constitution. Our constitution sets forth faculties, but also limitations in acting of people governing us in Latin American countries. That's why going beyond, strictly technical items like sustainability in pension systems, the bottom idea is to see this from the social standpoint, being convinced that social security in the 21st century revolves around a key legal principle, social solidarity for everybody and from everybody, based on international law of current social security. Now, social security are the legal instruments that were created by our countries, Latin American countries, to provide this security mantle for their populations. This requires long range public policies. That's why their financial sustainability is a national obligation. Nevertheless, we shouldn't lose sight of the great frailty and the profound problems that we find in social security in our beloved Latin America, starting alphabetically with Argentina all the way to Venezuela. That's why, well, this being a Latin America regional forum, I would like to ask my peers in the panel and our attendees to this forum just a couple of unsettling questions. First of which is, how do you think the sustainability of your national social security will be in 1 or 2 decades from now? Let's say 2030, 2040. And second question, do you think that the current structure will withstand the economic disaster and unemployment that this world pandemic left us with, which tempestuously has overpassed all our national social security systems in Latin America? So, going beyond the possible answers, let us remember that every single national social security system should be evolving at the same time as society does, always acting under the legal principles of good faith, solidarity, and progressivity. Because law might serve in regulating the harsh and difficult reality, And legal sciences are not only ruled by the Constitution, but it's integrated and complemented by agreements and current international covenants recognized by the country, which are part of our national legal systems. Nowadays, we're living in unprecedented times in this risky and globalized world in several spheres: political, economical, social, educational. Right now, everywhere, nationalism and populism is exacerbated under the phrase, if you're not with me, you're against me. There's a lot of scholars, me included, because I've been a scholar for half a century now, who think that that has opened even a larger gap in society, and that this inequality gap in Latin America, which is the region largest inequalities of in the planet, everything is ideologized. And what these matters do is for us not to be able to reach an agreement, trying to look for a better way to structure our social securities for them to be able to withstand what's coming. So the problem is, or the point is that in such a complex reality, pensions and the social security, it's very complicated because again, social security, it's not really like ILO calls total works that envelops the formal sector of the economy, that is, say, employees, and every single person working in the informal sector, being the informal sector, one largest size, and to top it off, it doesn't have social security. That's why we have this contribution-based social security and one that's not contribution, almost always based on government assistance, which might be opaque and cannot be demanded to the government, to civil government, as opposed to social security, which is a human right, aside from being specialized social service in charge of a state, and the most transcendent. And many people haven't finished understanding this in terms of legality. I mean, the state is responsible before different courts, whether national or international. That's why I asked myself to need better that assistance-based structure created universal coverage and not like a lifelong rent to protect those in elementary poverty, taking care of vulnerable groups, and helping originary people. That would provide more legal certainty to poor people that just passing out some help. Because after 4 decades of fostering law in Social Security, and the decade where I was working in the legal sphere of Social Security during the 80s, I see a systematic dismantlement of Social Securities, but also the obvious neglect of the systems. Today, I'm worried because I see the market niches that have been created around Social Security, which should be a public service, being obvious that there's a niche for pension market, one for health market, another niche for housing, and yet another for social benefits. In summary, What happens is that nowadays we have more market and less state. A state that actually takes care, regulates, and defends the whole of the population. Going beyond that, Social Security, and be careful with what I'm going to say, very respectfully, should never be thought with just a one-sided vision, whether this is political, economic, or actuarial, medical, sociological, philosophical, or even legal. But it should be based on its own nature, a multidisciplinary construct. That, and no other thing would make us carry out a true restructuring for all pieces in the puzzle to be harmonized, thus avoiding discretionalities in the day-to-day operation of the system. I also think that scholar vision, no matter how transcendent this is, will never be enough. That's why we should be structuring this, all of us together, because no profession manages to cover all the different angles and perspectives of this protective mantle. But to achieve that, we do require from an open and plural social dialogue, with the idea of generating consensus and providing legitimacy to any reform proposal, setting aside ideologies, philias, and phobias. That's why I also think that this is a challenge to you. The Inter-American Conference Social Security should be spearheading this effort, forming part of the eventual solution, and trying to summon to a social dialogue in Latin America to stop the political class or financial factual powers to propose makeshift reforms, which, at the end of the day, will not solve structural problems of our social securities, while getting awareness that academia without politics is utopia, and politics without the academia is tyranny. So, us as social security people should be the voice of the voiceless, trying to serve a discontention them before caprices of our very peculiar political class, knowing very well that they might be right sometimes, but not always. Nobody's right all the time. And even more so, the ILO has proposed that scholars actively participate from social dialogue, overcoming the classical idea of this three-party system. And in the report of the World Conference of ILO regarding the future of labor from January 22nd, 2019, it is examined how to achieve a better labor future for everybody, total labor, due to the big challenges that we're faced against under this harsh reality. And it is required for us to invest in technology and science, which is something strategic, especially for this digital area, also known as Industry 4.0. This report from the ILO, I recommend you to read it. And I will finish my first presentation. Talks about new ways of working and all the different ramifications of the ever-changing nature of work. That is, say, work changes from legal nature to the institutional ramifications of the changing nature of work in the continent, towards the need of learning, long-lasting learning. This privileging gender equality when it comes to labor, opportunity, and income, and the right measurement of the well being of human beings, because that is the role that universal social security will take care of in such a way that if the production of goods and services has changed, At the same time, so too should Social Security change to accompany it. Because Social Security used to ride back in the train, right now it should be the locomotive pulling this hypothetical train. And well, in many countries, it's still tied to formal jobs. So the rest, people in informal jobs, do not have access to Social Security. Will find themselves in a very complex situation, but they have to choose whether going out in the street to feed their family, get infected, and die from COVID, or I mean, that is what we have to solve right now. How is it that we're going to protect these groups without jobs or even Social Security? But going beyond that, we should think this matter of remote labor, digital platforms, these so-called by ILO digital nomads, that no matter where they are, they will work with smartphones and internet. The unavoidable process of automation of human labor, which well now it's very clear to everybody. Things like home office, even like this webinar, this is a social phenomenon that's here to stay after being quarantined by COVID-19. So the question right now is, who should be spearheading contemporary social security under these digital raiders and by the poorly regulated work tertiarization, digital platforms, autonomous workers, and gender breach. So this is a crucial issue going towards the future. And as of the third decade of the 21st century, I can tell you, each and every one of us should be working towards the construction of a new social security model for the 21st century. Forgetting about the typical Bismarck style model social security of the second to last decade of the 19th century, and even time average of 1940s, because nowadays we have a huge inequality due to gender, age, social class, and ethnicity that we need to resolve. And the subject of equality is not negotiable because the framework of true social justice should remain in the highest echelon. That's it for my participation. Thank you very much, Doctor, for your participation. Of course, I would like to highlight the relevance that you put on the state because without it, we wouldn't have protection as we should in this environment of well being. And also, how Social Security should provide a security mantle for its citizens. And how this leads us to think that financial sustainability of Social Security should be a national item discussed broadly. And the doctor put out there some questions for our panel members, for our attendees. How do you think sustainability of Social Security will be in the next 34 years? And how are we going to face, or how are we withstanding the consequences of COVID in the different Social Security systems? Afterwards, he asks, what should Social Security do with workers under collaborative collaborative systems, independent workers, and some subjects left unanswered in the region, like gender inequality. He also touches upon the decisions of government, and he talks about public policies, and that Social Security should be in one way or the other, separated from all these problems and even political dynamics that we have in this country every 6 years, but really in every single political cycle. He also talks about dismantling of Social Security in the continent, probably not only in Mexico. And we should also mention that we have some good examples in the region regarding the universalization of social security that might serve as study cases for us to understand how this is working in other latitudes. Doctor also mentions that social security should not only be constructed on in one vision, but rather it should be multidisciplinary, and well, how the state should be spearheading this effort and calling a Latin American dialogue. Well, this conference is doing that. The relevance of this conference is obvious with the seminars, discussion panels, technical roundtables, and well, publishing of materials that call this dialogue and the integration of different visions and disciplines. And finally, in closing, he talked about the relevance of social security as the engine or locomotive of what the economy should be. So I have some questions for you, Doctor, so that you can reply to this during our Q&A. There are a lot of questions for you. But one of the questions is, what do you think about the reform to Article 4 of the Constitution? Talks about pensions. They also ask you regarding Social Security for faculty members of Guadalajara University. What do you think about that? So those are two questions I leave you now, Doctor. So we can go to the next panel member, Dr. Elsevier. I think that she's logged on. I don't know if you can enable your camera and microphone, please. Thank you, Doctor. We had some technical problems, but I will go over the guideline questions that we sent you, part of the dynamic of this roundtable. What technical elements should be considered in designing a correct pension system? How can these technical elements converge with social objectives? Because many times they're dissociated and they shouldn't be. And finally, how can technical and social aspects be translated into legal and institutional designs that are sustainable in the middle and long term? Something that warrants the effective right to dignifying pension. I know that you have a broad experience on the subject, and we would like to listen to your thoughts on the matter. Thanks very much, Doctor. Can you hear us, Doctor? I think we're having problems with the connection. Doctor says that she's probably on mute, but I don't see that. I think we might have problems in the connection, and now we will give a chance to Carlos Contreras, actuary of Inter-American Conference, to start with his presentation while we give the doctor a little bit of time to fix her microphone. So, Carlos, the floor is yours. Of course. Good afternoon. Can you hear me? Okay. Yeah. Perfect. Thank you very much. Yes, I would like to thank for the International Conference on Social Security for allowing me to participate in this very relevant regional forum, especially because of the subjects, the items we're dealing with not only in Mexico but pretty much throughout Latin America. And like Dr. Isabel Ortiz pointed out earlier, we're undergoing very important transformations. And all the transformations in terms of pensions really started out back in 1981 in Chile. And after going through this process of flourishing and evolution of social security systems, amongst which everything pertaining to pensions, to then going into this process of involution. That led to people to have the need saving individually to try during old age to be able to buy a financial product in the market, which is a lifelong rent to everything that entails. And what this generates is that with the savings that people have managed to accrue throughout his or her working life, he or she will not only have to buy a product in the insurance market, but another additional product with which you might have to pay a pension to s- people living behind, spouse, and so on. A lot has been said about the problems that we're living in terms of pensions. That's why I will not elaborate on that. But there's something that I should reiterate, especially in the language that we use every day in this subject. And that's the first thing we should think about whether Social Security is wrong. And I think that immediately a lot of people will say, yeah, Social Security is wrong. But I would invite you to first think about this question. Why? Because we need to start from the base that Social Security is a right, a human right, warranted in the International Declaration of Human Rights, complemented by other piece of legislation in the same act, Article 25, says that everybody is entitled to insurance in old age, medical assistance. And I think that having a right is not wrong. It's like saying education, which is a right, is wrong, or life, which is another right, is wrong. And the truth is that everybody agree that the right to life, education, and so many other rights set forth in the Declaration are not wrong. What's really wrong is the actions that we carry out. Not only people, institutions, but in general, different role players in society. We haven't know how to act adequately, efficiently, to be able to generate or to produce institutions that will truly guarantee the right to social security. So, for example, and being focusing more on the guide-like questions of this panel, the first thing I should say is that rights or social security is not wrong. What's wrong is what we're doing or we're not doing to deliver that social security towards the population. So, our subject of study should really be the population, people, each members of the society, with all the characteristics that entails. Population, nowadays we know that by having a structure graphically represented a couple of years ago as a pyramid, now is represented as a rectangle, and some say that in the future will be represented by an inverted pyramid. So we need to take into consideration the demographic transition and aging of population and even gender elements. Like we know that life expectancy for female gender is usually larger in people, and that's a fact that we cannot change. We should also take into consideration some defects in the labor market. Defects like wage gaps, where uh, where women are impacted with a lower wages. The fact of being woman brings about that there's a continuous going in and out of the labor market, and that's a fact that we cannot change. And also, in terms of population, we need to take into consideration 50% to analyze them and to be able to tend to them. So, Social Security and the right to Social Security doesn't entail solving the problems of the population. It doesn't entail solving the problems of the labor market, but rather tend to them because they're there and we need to take these into consideration. The same thing happens in economic and financial terms, really. In this case, no matter how much we want, we will always have the sustained increase of prices. We will have an inflation, and that's something that we shouldn't correct, but tend to, because it does exist and it's a phenomenon that will be there. Same goes for interest rates. Nowadays, it might call our attention that we have negative interest rates in certain parts of the world, or some bonds issued with interest rates equal to zero, and that's something that we're not going to correct, but we need to tend to. Same thing happens if we talk about legal sphere. This sphere is not unmovable, but it's worth respect because laws are there for a reason. They're there precisely for a state to be able to function as such. And without delving into legal matters, otherwise Dr. Angel Guillermo will tell me you're not an attorney. So why are you talking about this? But we do know that there is a hierarchy, and we need to respect that hierarchy. And what do I mean by this? In countries like Mexico, some other countries in Latin America, it's been determined that an international agreement has the same strength as, the very constitution. So, I mean, right now, if our countries have ratified the agreement one of two from ILO, and that talks about minimum wages when it comes to pensions. This is something that we cannot neglect, we cannot evade, and we need to tend to. I'm not going to set aside political matters because that also has an influence, and sometimes, technical aspects, political aspects seem incompatible. The reality is that we should also take it into consideration because it's an element or a factor or a group of factors at present there, and with which or against which we won't be able to fight. We won't be able to correct them whether they're wrong, but we need to tend also the political factors. So, what do I mean by all this? I have talked about at least four important groups of factors which are there, and well, they all have different characteristics in each of the countries, and whenever we want to design social security system, well, we need to study those to be able to create this tailor-made suit. So a pension system cannot just follow one single recipe, making an analogy to a cooking recipe. Some people will have the ingredients, some won't. Same thing happens with social security and pension systems. We cannot talk about that what worked for a society is exactly what will work for another. I mean, exactly in the same terms, it will exactly have the same results. That's impossible. Hence, we cannot just copy what's been done in another country. Of course, we can analyze it. That's why we have best practices. Best practices, which are groups of actions undertaken by different states to tend to their problems, which might be similar, and that similar solutions have worked. And again, we cannot just take the suit that fit a society and try to fit it to another society of or a group of people because it will be too large or too small. It's not what that society needs. Unfortunately, pension reforms like the ones we've had in the last 39 years since 1991 in Chile, we've seen that they haven't behaved in this way. This might seem models, taking out of a desktop, probably designed while listening to very pleasant music. Somebody was, behind his desk. All of a sudden, he had this idea, and he thought that this idea was the best. But in the real world, the characteristics of a population does not necessarily respond to what that person thought in that desktop. That's why nowadays we see that whenever we talk about individual account systems, many people usually say, well, the systems are good. What happens is that the labor market is not solid. People come and go, in and out from labor market. Or this account system is good, but women tend to live longer than men. Forests are good. The problem is that population is aged. So under this language, what's happening is that the reality of the population should adjust to this tabletop or desk model. And I insist the model Whichever model we create will need to tend the problems of the society, and society does not need to adapt or adjust to that model. That's why it's very important that that reality is combined with all technical elements I've talked about. And, well, of course, I concur to what Dr. Angel Guillermo said regarding the working on pensions. I mean, it's not enough to study it or to work it from a political standpoint, actuarial standpoint, scholar standpoint, because Social Security and pension systems need to be constructed, to be built from an inter and multidisciplinary focus. Where, by the way, this multi and interdisciplinary focus should not necessarily be the first step. That's why it's relevant what the ILO has said about this three-party system, about social dialogue. All society needs to participate towards the construction of a pension system because it will tend to that very society with the benefits that will be rendered. So whoever has something to say should be listened. Why? Well, after this large social dialogue, we'll be able to generate, to come up with a design. That might be theoretical even, but with that theoretical model, we'll know that we'll be able to tend all the needs of the society with its different characteristics. But for well, for later, that scheme that we created can be assessed to be able to know whether that system will work today, tomorrow, and in many years to come. Something that's feasible and financially sustainable. Of course, we would need actuarial work to be able to work on the estimations. And be careful, these are estimations. This is not a prognosis. This is not a prophecy. This is not guesswork, only estimations of what might happen in the future. And why doing this? Well, for us to see whether that scheme that was created to tend the problems of the society will be sustainable, to know whether we'll be able to have enough resources to be able to finance it before any eventuality under different scenarios, both optimistic and pessimistic. Pessimistic, like now we know that we need to take into consideration the effects of a pandemic, and based on that, making a scheme adjustment, but always thinking that we need to tend to the problems of the society, and we need to tend all the problems around the different elements that I've mentioned. What will we achieve with this? Well, we will achieve to have a semi-finished product because there's still an important part missing. Thus, I insist on multidisciplinarity. Next part is, well, I already know and I already have this scheme that will tend society, providing them benefits that they want, benefits which are sufficient in the short, medium, and long term. But now we need to take them to a regulation, standardization. We need to take them to law. What for? Well, because we know the Social Security is also based on the principle of being being mandatory, and it should be in the statutory regime based on the law for it to be for it to be fulfilled, for it to be warranted, for everybody to have the right with whoever they need to go and demand receiving the benefits that will tend, on the one hand, to their needs and, well, to risks. So in that, I finished my first participation, saying that this series of steps, which are not a recipe, but rather directives based on international organizations. I've mentioned, I mean, ILO, but also ICT and CISS. It's something that's been going on. And, well, if you want to go over the website of the Inter-American Conference of Social Security, there's a proposal there for the Mexican case, in which we will to reform more or less with what I've said and some other additional elements that were taken into consideration to best analyze and study particularities of a Mexican society. just like certain particularities of the Panamanian, Brazilian, Argentinian, Canadian society should be analyzed for us to be able to build truly solid systems that will allow to tie on the one hand technical aspects and for this to tend to the problems of society. I will not elaborate on this. That's it for my first participation, and I would like to thank you for allowing me to speak in this forum. Thank you very much, Carlos. So I have you ask whether Social Security is wrong from the get-go, and you said that maybe what's wrong is the appreciation that we have of it because it's a right, just like education and health are rights. So there's a need to understand it as it truly is, and not as something else. Likewise, you say that how many countries elude their obligation. They undersign an agreement 102 of the ILO when it comes to providing pensions for retirees. And you also mentioned factors that we need to analyze when we seriously study the composition of a society. And you mentioned that the pension system cannot be a kitchen recipe. You cannot copy what worked in one country and trying to implement it as such in another. So there's no one size fits all. You also talk about the feeble arguments defending the pension systems of individual accounts, and you criticize it, saying that these are tabletop models serving a minority, and that these are thought of for society to adapt to them, and not for the models to are understood from a perspective, and something that can be adapted to the reality of the people in our countries. And like doctor, before you mentioned, you provide necessary relevance to multidisciplinarity that entails any serious analysis in the problems of social security and, of course, pensions. Just like in the first panel, you mentioned this social dialogue that we need to have to be able to transform pension systems, and you highlight the need to establish in the law the benefits people are entitled to when they reach certain age, and you make this nod to the defined benefit that should be legally established as opposed to what many countries have, in the case of Mexico, El Salvador, Chile, even, and the Dominican Republic, particularly. Dr. Elsevier, I don't know if you have your audio working right now. I cannot hear you yet, doctor. So we'll ask our technical area to try to correct Dr. Elsevier's connection. In the meantime, Carlos, I will pass on to you some questions from our audience. What benefits workers have when all the information that Afore Afores provide is hard to understand? More clearly, what can workers do if the information from this pension management systems it's not complete or comprehensive or that digestible once they start revising it and trying to add it up as people or laymen. Another question is outsourcing a risk for workers in the contributional sense to pensions. That's a question. So how how the outsourcing model works and what are their implications in terms of pensions? to which people living their lives under these hiring models live their lives. So, well, your participation is extremely relevant. The first, from a legal standpoint, with many years of experience providing a lot of clarity to the subject, and Carlos's participation, of course. I think that you've worked in Social Security for most of your life, and your contributions to the conference have been very valuable. So, will we establish a connection with a doctor? I don't know if Dr. Angel would like to start with questions I said in the beginning. But it's an article first, but rather Article 4, made by President Lopez Obrador recently. What do you think about these modifications to the Constitution? Thank you very much. I'll try to provide an answer to these questions so that everybody can understand. I celebrate the reform to Article 4 of the Constitution, and establishes pensions for elderly people. I could demand that. However, because of my age, I don't know. I think what's been done right now, good in Mexico, is very celebrated, but that's usually the case. When an institution like IMSS does 100 successful kidney transplants, just with one that goes wrong, that will make the news. So that's the way we are, not only in Mexico, but in Latin America. Maybe we should focus on the good instead of focusing on the bad. Thinking about this institution like Fernando Benitez said, we're talking about IMSS, and they said that they had like first-class facilities with second-class personnel, with medication third class, and this we need to understand that social securities in reality do not belong to the state, but there are citizens operated by the state, yes, through decentralized public organizations. But I do applaud the reforms to Article 4 because I think they were necessary. And yet, me particularly, if I had a pension, Social Security, even if it's like 5,000 pesos, that's my reality. That is my reality. And then I'll explain why when I answer a second question. What I can assure you, though, is that it would be better for us to integrate different layers of social protection, essentialism, social security, and complementary systems, which are what is recognized by ILO, and even if they sound the same, all of this integrates what the ILO refers to as social security. So that's one of the things that calls my attention personally. But Article number 4 should be the first echelon, like happens in Europe. The first echelon to Social Security, that's social assistance. But these are different in nature, because it's not the same assisting than assuring. It's not the same thing preventing than assuring. What I mean is that to us, this demandable right to the state, and I can take that anywhere, and I celebrate that. Of course, I applaud that. However, I would like to tell you that I've done some field work in the PhD that I coordinate in the University of Guadalajara. And we haven't been able to locate the beneficiaries from these programs because nobody, I mean, not all of them are there. And in that sense, the issue of transparency is of great importance. Try to redistribute these matters because at the end of the day, is us Mexicans we're covering that assistance support with our taxes, and I applaud that it exists. It exists in the Constitution, thing that we didn't have for a long time. Because I think that assistantialism hurts one's pride, dignity. That's why I will collect my 5,000 pesos tomorrow, the day after. That's when I get my pension. Even less than 5,000 pesos. And you might ask me why. Well, I didn't want to go into modality number 40. And the reality is social insurances, social securities is some sort of saving box. For the moment, we were tired. The thing is that in Latin America, we didn't have this culture of we usually don't think about the future, and we don't think that we're gonna die. We don't like to think that we're gonna die. That's lack of social provision in our countries in modern America. Then going to the next question, this about the University of Guadalajara, the problem with the pensions. So those of us were under the law of 1973, Social Security, all of us scholars and admin workers, we had the right access to Social Security. They took that from us. Who negotiated that? Well, I know what happened. I wrote a book about pensionary systems of public university in Mexico from Editorial Porrua. And out of all the books I've written, that's the one that sold the least because at the end, nobody wanted to know. I mean, there should have been some sort of reason in that sense. But pension and retirement regime brings together two different pensions. One, work pension for age of years of service, and the other has to do with Social Security. Like it happens under the regime of retirement and pension, IMSS workers, and it called my attention that under the reform initiative proposed 3 days ago by the press in Congress, it said in one of the transitory articles that Mexican Secretary of Treasury will need to overlook this regime of retirements and pension, and you need to be informed by IMSS about it. So I think that there's a complicated subject there. Why? Because one thing is centralized administration, and president with all the state secretaries, and some things very different. Decentralized public organizations having their own internal governance or mechanisms. So now it turns out that this will be oversight. I don't think that's. I think that that's legally abnormal, but it is what it is. And well, just to answer to outsourcing question, outsourcing is necessary and it's recognized by the ILO. The thing is that we do everything a la Mexican. So, I mean, we used the Chilean model, but we only used half. So we did it wrong. Trying to apply that model, we thought it would work, and guess what? It didn't. And me, from the very beginning, I've been saying this for over 20 years in my books, that model will never work. However, when the ILO talks about restabilizing pensions, to me, it's been truly amazing that they're defending themselves. And now that the fees are lower, because I mean I read the whole thing, a couple times and haven't been able to sleep for a couple of days now. Because I say, well, why? If we can do a profound structural reform like the one proposed by the Inter-American Conference of Social Security, we choose this small makeshift reform. I mean, we take so long in becoming aware that few people will be pensioned under this scheme, especially now when so much informality in work because of COVID, and this will start working very soon. I mean, that's why I applaud the decision of lowering the contribution weeks because at the end of the day, federal government would end up paying more. So if right now the federal budget for 2021, one out of every 5 pesos will go to Social Security, you tell me whether this system is operating correctly. And I would say no, because it's been historically demonstrated, and with this I end my participation, that during crisis is when Social Security has flourished the most. So I think that the largest challenge lies there. Thank you very much, Doctor. You provided a very comprehensive answer to these questions. And well, you gave book recommendations in case you're interested about social security schemes in Mexican public universities, and also you provide an answer to the question about outsourcing and how it was Mexicanized. Thank you very much for your contribution. And now we will try to pass the floor to Doctor, see if she's already available. So thank you very much, Doctor. Doctor Elsevier, can you hear us?
It looks like it's working. Wonderful. Hello, doctor. So I will ask again the guiding questions for your presentation. So what technical elements need to be considered in the correct design of a pension system? How can the technical elements converge with social elements in a pension system? And how can the social and technical aspects be translated into sustainable, legal, and social elements in the long term for the pension systems? So with no further ado, Doctor, if you could please start your presentation. Please go ahead, Doctor. The connection is still deficient. We cannot get constant audio. So in the meantime, uh, Carlos, maybe you can go and answer the questions I asked just a while ago about what you think of outsourcing and what you think about people's pensions. And what is your vision about workers not having a full vision of what pension fund managers in Chile, for example, have? And what about this lack of information? Thank you, Tonatiuh. The system is indeed very complex. It happens in Mexico. I have seen it in El Salvador too. People say this is very simple. They are like, okay, more savings, fewer commissions, more service, and that's equal to better pensions. And they think that it's only these three elements. But behind those so-called basic elements, there are many more things because there is a whole machinery. We're talking about contributions. In Mexico, for example, they go to an institution such as IMSS, and then they distribute it to different managers depending on how each person decided that their funds were going to be managed. And then there is also a circulation with pension fund management and multi funds and the like. So, what we see is that investments are regulated. We will not delve into that, whether that regulation is appropriate or right or not. Now, let's talk about qualified, not qualified, semi qualified workers. I mean, we can talk about anyone, people who have a lot of education and in social sciences, for example, but in spite of their education, they will not necessarily understand everything that is behind that, economically speaking and financially speaking. So they are trying to make it so simple, supposedly, and just three factors, but actually the system is not understandable for society. So, one college professor in Canada actually published a paper about this pensions in Canada. He analyzes the factors, he considers different elements, economic elements, legal elements, and many things. But also, on the technical side, he is saying that actually the pension system has to be good for all society because he's an actuary, so he is trying to make people understand. I mean, they need to know when, how, exactly, without going through bank statements, for example. In Mexico, for example, they say reading your bank statement is really easy. That statement is easy because you have your contribution, you have your yield, you have your end balance, and then we have the net return index. So supposedly, if you have a better index, then you have better savings, right? However, the small print is telling you that that will not necessarily guarantee that it's going to be good in the future. And then if you delve into that, you realize that there are mistakes. Think, for example, of 36 months as a period for that whole yield minus 2 months. I mean, what I'm trying to say is that it doesn't matter what kind of education people have. Usually, this is really difficult to understand. For example, Donatio, you can understand that it's not only about reading, it's about going through the statement and thinking of what is behind it and about the regulations. And that happens in the Dominican Republic, in El Salvador, in Chile, and you have to go back and think of what the regulation is saying. And there is a whole network of things here, and we need to understand that. But usually, people don't understand it so easily. They understand less and less why when they are old, they will have the minimum pension guaranteed, like the basic solidarity one in Chile, or the minimum guaranteed pension that is going to be established in Mexico. And it looks like the promise is okay, you'll get a pension, but beware because you'll get the minimum pension, and we'll see what you can buy with that. And finally, outsourcing. I mean, it could be, but I will let the labor experts answer that. Now, the problem here is how that is regulated, how that is sanctioned, even when there is non-compliance, because at the end of the day, there is a contract. People sign a contract, right? Maybe not with the company directly, but through another company. That is also sort of a complex scheme. So why isn't there an employer that is responsible for that, right? Because on the one hand, there is a contract with an employer, and at the same time, there is a contract because I'm working for somebody else, right? That's another agency. So outsourcing needs to be regulated and supervised. But also going further back, we have to understand what has been said in these two panels in this forum. If we keep on linking social security systems exclusively to the formal labor market in terms of dependency, then what we will have is that many people, when they are older, because they worked independently and they did not make any contributions and they are not affiliated to any institutions, or maybe they didn't even know that they could actually save money in a pension fund manager, then they're like, okay, what are they going to be when they're senior citizens? Some people will say that that's a programmatic question, right? I mean, that's a programmatic issue that we only have to prepare for, right? It's not so simple. We have to understand old age as a risk. I mean, to begin with, maybe we'll get there, maybe not. And now let's think that we get to that pension year when we turn 65, not necessarily, of course, but it could be the case. We need to consider that the physical and mental capacities of the person will be differentiated. So we need to consider all that. What I want to say is that the big problem with outsourcing is that it's not well regulated, it is not supervised, it is not sanctioned. I mean, I think that beyond that, we need to make sure that as much as possible, the right to social security needs to be separated from the right to work. That's actually a part of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. 22 and 23. Those are the two articles that talk about Social Security and work, right? I mean, sure, there is a link, but it's not the only link. It's not like if people did not work under the conditions that are supposed to be the conditions, that doesn't mean that they cannot get a pension when they get to that age. Thank you very much, Carlos, for your participation and for your answers. We can go back to this later, but somebody was asking also about what actions could be taken so that the Social Security statements show the contributions and the weeks and all that. Now, maybe we have a question for the doctor here about workers. And there were also some people who were saying, like, okay, I have 100,000 pesos here, and after so many years, it's still 100,000 pesos. So, what's the profit for workers? Now, we will try to connect through audio only without video to see if the doctor can join us. Dr. Elsevier, can you hear us? In the meantime, I would like to remind everybody who is watching. I think we have close to 250 attendees in this seminar, in this experts panel. I remind you that you can ask your questions in the chat. We are looking at that with our speakers too. So, Dr. Elsevier, can you hear us? Okay, while we figure out what is happening with the doctor, I will keep on asking the questions. I would like to talk about something that's really important, which is, in a way, outside the analysis, and it shouldn't be because at the end of the day, it's a part of what we are dealing with in this panel, and that's the financial sustainability of the pension systems. Carlos, you were saying that there is no custom made suit. There is no one size fits all, right? You need to. Let me rephrase that. There is no one size fits all. You have to actually build custom made suits, you know, based on the characteristics of the economy and the different characteristics in the countries. However, we can also say that there is a quite separated field. the types and the models of pensions which can encourage financial viability for pension systems understood in the context of social security. That is to say that they are redistributive and solidary, but there are some others that are not. So, Carlos, how can we structure a sustainable pension systems? And I mean financially sustainable, at least in theory. I know that in practice that will be different, and we need to consider some of the things that you already mentioned. But how should we think of this financial viability? And then, Doctor, in terms of financial sustainability, how far does the state's responsibility go? Or is it an infinite responsibility by the states to have available resources to guarantee this human right to social security and to pensions? How can this match a vision where you also have, I mean, where they also have to provide infrastructures, health, education, and the like, as governments for society? So, Carlos, if you'd like to begin. Of course, thank you. Let me go back to the custom-made suit. I think that experts in the matter coincide here. The pension system needs to be created by considering the characteristics of the population and the economy and the like. Now, let's think of a tailor and a custom made suit. There are some basic tools for any tailor, which they will use for any suit, for any person with their own characteristics, right? So, needle, scissors, fabric, etc. Same thing for Social Security. Some tools are basic and they need to be taken into account, but that doesn't mean that they are the only tools. Actually, in time, maybe some other tools will be invented, but at least with the tools that you have, well, you have to work with that to create that custom made suit. So, what are these tools, technically speaking, first? Many things have been said about that. That is a paradigm we have insisted on since the beginning of the conference, and in the National University of Mexico, I have done that too. We need to break that paradigm. It looks like people think there are only two types of pension funds, right? Like defined contributions, which they think is simply a defined distribution benefit in individual accounts, but that is a paradigm that definitely needs to be broken. I don't know when that was brought about or where in the literature that was brought up. I mean, I kind of have an idea, but I'm not 100% sure. We see that there are different characteristics combined from different pension systems in order to try to explain only two, and those two do not necessarily match. They do not necessarily fit into those characteristics, the two characteristics that were mentioned. When we talk about defined contribution and benefit, when we analyze the first social securities that were created, not only in the Americas but in other parts of the world as well, we realize that those pension insurances were defined with a defined contribution and a defined benefit because there was an actuarial study that defined how much needed to be contributed with in order to offer a specific profit under certain conditions that needed to be met. So some people go like, okay, you either have the profit or you have the contribution, but that's false. That's not true. Now we see that in pension fund management and in different agencies, like a foreign, for example, then you can see all that and you see how much you need to contribute to get to a certain level of profit. And then the distribution, which is a way to finance that profit that does exist, that was created. But it's about distributing precisely, distributing the cost, for example. That is what we call a yearly valuation process. I mean, you distribute every year the monetary amounts that you have, for example, salaries for people or the budget, the expense budget for the government, for the federation, but you do that on a yearly basis. And I say this with all due respect, but this is simply a quotient. This is only a division which has nothing that can be considered actuarial. So think of the money that a person gets when they have a disease and then after a while they cannot work. Maybe that's a 1 year period, and that works. That works because how long it will be paid has been established. Think of a building, for example. I mean, you know how much you're gonna pay, but maybe you don't know how long you're gonna pay. It's like the pension, for example. You know that the person will stop paying when they die, but you don't know when that's gonna happen, right? So that is why we have other tailoring uh, tools like actuarial methodologies, so that we can actually make sure that that works as insurance schemes. In any insurance scheme has to be fully funded, right? Because sometimes we go like partially funded or partially capitalized. We have not understood that if we take pension systems and we take one of those components as an insurance scheme, well, you know how much you have to pay for that specific profit amount and how much you are contributing and how much the government is contributing and the employer is contributing, so that will all add up to the amount for your pension. And so you perform a technical study that will guarantee that that is actually well funded. And that is, again, the actuarial part. That's merely estimates. It's not a prophecy, it's not a forecast, which will only be used only to verify that the conditions that was designed with are still maintained, and that will lead to financial sustainability. Financial sustainability is really important. It's not like, okay, we need money for 1 year or for one presidential administration or for 20 years. No, we need to look at that considering the long run. How long is that? Well, that depends. Some people say 100 years, some people go like contributions for three generations. Actuarial practice sometimes says 75 years, so it's more than just 5 years or 6 years, right? We need to look at a longer term and we need to make sure that you have enough resources to pay those pledges, right? Of course, it is expensive. A minimum guaranteed person in Mexico requires approximately 1 million pesos at age 65, so of course it's expensive. If you don't have the necessary resources and you're not willing to pay what's necessary to get those significant sums of money, well, then you have to complement. Maybe you reduce the benefits there, and you can do a hybrid model where you have your social protection basis, and then that's a basic model, and you complement it with social security because that's a human right as well. A right to savings, yes, but also a right to that social security. And you need to make sure that the contributions are enough so that there are savings and people get that benefit. But we need to make sure that this is not so expensive for a public company or a social security company. Thank you, Carlos. So I understand the difference between the cost implied by a social security based on a defined profit, as you mentioned, and then you clarified what the multi-pillar system is in terms of having lower cost compared to the first one. So, Doctor, what's your take on that? Because Carlos was talking about this contribution part for Social Security and how you put that together. But how far does this responsibility go? How can we make this state's responsibility match the society's responsibility? Because, I mean, sometimes society does not contribute to Social Security, and it's not like they don't want to, but actually, in a region, uh, workers are being, in a way, banned from the formal market. So, how far does the state's contributions go to guarantee a good pension in terms of financial sustainability as well, because there is a financial pressure on public finance. Indeed. So, how responsible is the state, right? How far does its responsibility go? That's a concerning question. So, the state is responsible, the main guarantor of Social Security. It's not because I say it. If we look at international regulations, everything is clearly explained. Now, Antonio, if you allow me, I will talk a little bit about this. Yes, please go ahead. So we're talking about the 102 ILO convention and why have we not really done that well? This convention goes back to the 1950s since it started in Mexico. That convention does consider unemployment. However, Mexico did not accept that part of the 102 ILO convention, and Mexico has not wanted to do that. I don't know why, because we would have avoided so many problems with the COVID-19 pandemic if we had an unemployment insurance. And maybe not as many jobs as were lost would have been lost. So, where are the state's obligations established for all states? Let me start. Many experts actually are not aware of this, but the Philadelphia Declaration, which is part of Annex 3 of the Constitution of the International Labor Organization, they establish Social Security. Articles 22 and 23 of the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights set forth the obligation of the state to provide this public service. Article 22 and then Article 25 talks about social protection, but I would also like to quote it for social security. Now, if we look at the San Jose Costa Rica Pact, when the Inter American Commission on Human Rights and the Inter American Court of Human Rights were created, based in Washington and Costa Rica, respectively. Well, and then we can go to the San Salvador Protocol. That is another powerful legal instrument, and we realize that actually the main guarantor is the Mexican state. And let me go deeper into the matter. In the International Pact of Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, in Article 29, it has maybe the most powerful text about international law for Social Security. What does it tell us? It's only 1.5 lines. It says that the states that are parties to this Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights Pact, they say like those member states recognize they recognize that every person has the right to social security, even as insurance. So let's not confuse that. We have social security as a legal system, so to speak, that was the basis. But there is a different connotation there related to that utopia that we call social security. I mean, it's utopic, but we can do that as long as we structure that obligation correctly, legally speaking. What happens with the Mexican constitution? I'm sorry, but I have to say this at an international level. What happens is that the original social security of the Mexican Institute the uh, of Social Security under the law, the act published on January the 19th, 1943, and then considering Article 123 of the Constitution. I mean, with all that, I think that that's when we really lost our way. The compass was not right because there are some bases and foundations that need to be complied with. But in this article of the Constitution, 123, in subsection 29, they are saying that this Social Security is of public utility. And then they start quoting what happens in Mexico. Now, in terms of the legislation, I used to work in legislation at the Senate and in the state of Jalisco as well. Now, a development should be made so that people develop the same ideas. For example, the principle of solidarity and unity. How many social securities do we have in the country? I will give you an award if you can tell me. So, actually, a student who actually published a book, she was a doctoral student. She found out in her research that in Mexico we have 55 social securities, all of them with different names and all of them with different benefits, all of them protecting a specific group, and all of them with their particular defense mechanisms. We have four federal social securities, including ISSSTE, IMSS, and Infonavit, and we have 51 local social securities. In Coahuila, for example, I think we have 13 or 14, I think, if I'm not mistaken. And in many states, like Jalisco, we only have one. We have state social security, so to speak, for the 32 states in Mexico, and they are protecting local public officers. So, how can we understand that Social Security is in chaos if we don't even know the basics? I think that we can also apply a phrase that I read from Roberto Gargarella, a friend from Argentina, in a very famous book, The Machine Room of the Constitution in Spanish. We need to consider that. We need to consider that in Jalisco, for example, where they want to promote a constitution, well, that's like a machine room, and there's a whole legal thing and the whole political thing. But anyway, he was saying, tell me how much taxes you pay and how they are managed, and I will tell you how many rights you have. The point is, nobody likes to pay contributions. And the tax part of Social Security is quite an issue because the basis for that is Article 123 of the Constitution, and this article deals with labor and social welfare, not Social Security or labor social welfare. That's a different thing. And that's why in Mexico the situation is like it is. And for years, for example, actually in December when I was on vacation, I was looking at a book about pensions written by Tirado Blas. And now let me tell you something, Carlos, because I agree with what you have said. It's not the big pending challenge in Mexico, it's actually an outstanding issue for the whole wide world. Because they don't have the solvency. A social security cannot go bankrupt. I mean, that would be a failed state. So I knock on wood, but I don't know what the future is going to be. I mean, for my children, for example, or my grandkids, I don't know, and I don't know about the future of all generations, future generations who will replace those of us who are older, because I mean that's what's gonna happen. But I think that here we need a good education to really be ready for that. I think that we need to install that in our children. We really need to have that social security education. Look at the Universal Declaration. We all have that right. So when it says all, that's universal, right? That could be built, of course. This can be utopic, yeah, but we can have consensus, we can have agreement among the classical three parties, right? The employers, the government, the employees, but also social groups, representatives like universities and the like, to structure the system. I mean, not the system that we want, but the system that we can build that also has actuarial solvency, because otherwise it's a scam. This needs to be sustainable. And the only person who's, I mean, the only responsible party here is the state, nobody else. Look at all those documents I mentioned. And also look at General Observation number 19 of the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations. It sets forth in a series of paragraphs a really powerful document. Of course, our authorities need to go over that document, our legislators need to do that. People who are in government, both federal and state government, they need to look at that to rebuild pension systems. We have to do it, absolutely. There's no other way. And those of us who are in academia, that's also up to us. That is why I am suggesting that we all participate. It's not only an economic vision or actuarial vision or medical vision or a legal or social logical or philosophical vision. And I mean, I don't want to point any fingers, but I also think that the Inter American Conference on Social Security needs to do that. I said that during a conference at UNAM, at the university. If I had to choose, I would choose what the Inter American Conference on Social Security worked on so much, and I am sure that Carlos and many other people would agree with me. I would choose that for a reform, an actual structural reform in Mexico. Thank you, Doctor. Thank you for that task as well, so to speak, because at this conference we also have the task, right? So in terms of pensions, that is also what we are are proposing. So what's the name of the book you were mentioning? I mean, you mentioned several books, right, the doctor? So if you can maybe repeat those. And is there anything about IMSS pensions and retirements? So what's the name of the book? Well, I'll look at the other questions. Yes, of course. There are books that I wrote to teach Social Security law for lawyers, for philosophers, accountants, actuaries, and it is called in Spanish New Social Security Law. And now, because of the lockdown, I updated this book up to June 2020, but I think that I will have to update it. And now with this proposal, I will have to wait for the proposal to publish it again. So it's Nuevo Derecho de la Seguridad Social, New Social Security Law in Spanish. It's 1,000 pages. It's not easy, but it talks about historical matters and even defense mechanisms that have to be used by people who are in this kind of system. And there is another book which is called Las Afore. That's the system in Mexico, or one of the systems in Mexico. And there is also another book about pension systems in public universities in Mexico. And I think that maybe that costs 150 Mexican pesos, so you can buy that. I mean, it's affordable. And there is another book published in March 2020. I wanted actually to present the book at the university, but I couldn't because of COVID. And it's called, in Spanish, uh, The Pensions, the Big Outstanding Challenge for Mexico. They are published by Porrua. And this book deals with all sorts of pensions. And we can go to national courts, and if they don't listen, then we can go to international courts and demand that, because I believe that is like that. It's not about making profit from this. I mean, when you write a book, you do it because you thought you had something to say about that. And I'm sure that we can get something from this. I know that perfectly well, but I haven't done an analysis on the IMSS pension system. Before, it was actually more convenient to get your pension because you had more money than actually working, right? But that was because there was a double pension. It was because of work and then also the one pertaining to Social Security, but that was completely different. But who knows? Since I don't have that much to do now, maybe I will work on that. Of course, doctor. Carlos, someone is asking a question about what mechanisms can be used by the state and the decentralized organisms to provide financial sustainability considering the current financial situation. And also a direct question for you. How do you see moving Afores to the public sector? And how to see that as notional accounts for new contributors in the public sector without commissions paid? Thank you, Donatiu. So those notional accounts were thought of by an American living in Sweden because he thought that could work, and it has worked relatively well. It has worked relatively well because of the fact that they are a nation with very particular economic characteristics. But there is also a particular element which makes notional accounts functional for them. We have a relatively stable population. They tend to grow, of course, but the growth is not as accelerated as it is in some countries of the Americas, for example, or some Asian and African countries. Actually, they have gotten to a point where the structure of the population is pretty much maintained, and senior citizens are actually a very significant group of the total of the population. So when someone tells us that the solution is in Sweden because they have notional accounts over there, which is like individual virtual accounts, well, let's not rule out analyzing that experience, why it was created, what are its characteristics, but let's not go back to just following a recipe, right? Because our country does not have a relatively stable population. We have not gotten to that point where active population, children, and senior citizens are about the same percentage. No. And so it doesn't make sense to have that notional account system. So maybe people go like, okay, maybe we can apply that to the public sector. Why? Because maybe a group of population in the public sector, well, we know that they have some stability with little employment mobility once a person is in the public uh, sector, except for top management positions. Maybe a person will stay, I mean, other than that, people will stay there in their job for a lifetime. Maybe that could work then. But it's not like, okay, it worked over there, let's do it. It's like, no, 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 wait a minute, let's look at the functional important characteristics. Now, about the resources managed by Afore, moving to a public management. Okay, let me go back in time. When social securities were moved to individual and mandatory savings, well, some people go like, okay, governments are bad at managing. And yes, that has been the case, but it has not always been the case. And this is not only a specific country. In any country in the world, we've seen good and bad governments. But what's concerning is when the government says that we need to reform the pension systems because the government is bad. That's when you wonder, like, okay, you were elected. However, it was, but you were elected. And now you're telling me that you are incapable of doing things right. You're telling me that you're bad. So, like, when I was voting, you had a lot of promises, and now you're just giving me excuses. So, I mean, that argument that the government is bad, well, sure, there have been some bad experiences, not all of them, of course, but that happens all over the world. That's on the one hand. And on the other hand, the Inter American Commission on Social Security has issued some recommendations. I have worked there for close to 7 years. And saving is not bad. I always ask people I train or my students at the university, I ask them, okay, if you can and you want to, do you save? And some students, if they have some extra income, they save money because they know that's a good thing, but we know that that's not enough. There are some people who, because of their particular economy, even though they want to save, they can't save money. So we need to encourage saving, but because of what I mentioned, that needs to be a complement to other instruments and other pillars. As we said, a social protection basis and sort of an insurance scheme. And if savings are managed publicly or privately, well, it doesn't matter where they are. What we need is supervision and strong regulation, obviously, with a very strong supervising organization, right? It's not like if someone says, oh, hey, I don't like this regulation and I have financial power, so I will create some propaganda so that you're in trouble and so that people see that you are not fair. So I don't think it's bad that governments manage the resources, but they need to be based on certain principles to avoid what happened in other times in other institutions where the money was used and probably the intention was uh, good, but they were using it for certain activities like building hospitals, for example. But those were like unipersonal decisions. No one was there to observe that and to make sure that the decisions were good. In the private sector, for example, solvency principles, they are not 100% applicable to social securities, but there are some elements that can be taken from that and they need to be taken into consideration so that we can guarantee that public entities that manage resources do it transparently following certain principles, and obviously that we do not lose those investments or that they do not end up being used for some activities or infrastructure that actually have no liquidity and then the money cannot be recovered. And well, I'm sure there are so many more things that are part of a different conversation. Thank you, Carlos. Unfortunately, we were not able to connect with the doctor. She is obviously an expert when it comes to pensions. However, I think that Dr. Angel Guillermo and Carlos Contreras, an actuary. I think that your participations were really enriching, and we think they were very good for us in terms of the analysis that you performed about the different aspects in these issues that we chose for the second panel of the Regional Forum on Pensions organized by the Inter-American Conference on Social Security. So this is the end of our second panel. Thank you again, Dr. Angel Guillermo Luis Moreno and Carlos Contreras Cruz, who were here with us. Also, the attendees, over 250 people who were listening to us. And the Inter American Conference on Social Security will continue tomorrow with this forum with two more panels. We would like to invite you again, and please keep on asking questions. Thank you, Carlos. Thank you, Doctor. Thank you for inviting me, and let me know if you need anything. Take care. You too. See you, Doctor. Goodbye, everybody.